The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
Well, yes, and it's a very good morning too, as I'm just trying to avoid my dog here. My dog just come in to say hello, so she's allowed to do that. This is Nala. Nala, this is Dan over there. Dan's
Hello,
over there.
Nala.
This is Nala. Go, let's go out of the studio. Go. Shoo. It's a very unprofessional way to start a broadcast with poet, writer, actor, and all-round amazing human being, Dan Goodwin. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
No worries. Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
Since COVID kicked in last year, as we go to air, I guess, as we record this, I should say, breaking news in New Zealand that there are now some cases in Christchurch that have just come up, which is a shock for everyone, I'm sure. But, you know, those complacent people that live down where I am in Dunedin, this is your wake-up call. But since COVID kicked in last year, the whole studio has been brought home, and so now we have the dog coming backwards and forwards, sometimes the children coming backwards and forwards during a live podcast. But as we're recording this during school hours, I think it'll just be the dog going upstairs and downstairs and upstairs and then out the back and then coming to the door and up. And anyway, hi Dan, nice to meet you and thanks for joining us, man.
Hey. I love the dog. What a nice touch.
Yeah, she's lovely. She's my little studio dog. She's only 11 months old. And her name is Nala, and she's a border collie. And she is cute as fuck. I don't know if that makes any logical sense at all to use that that descriptor, but she is. I've had quite a few. Are you a dog person yourself?
I am. My dog was living with my grandmother. I'm in a tiny apartment up in Auckland at the moment, so the closest I can come is house plants. But yeah, definitely a dog person.
There you go. I'll show you. There you go. There's the dog. That's her. Yeah. So she was. She's 11 months old, and I got her because I thought, you know, my kids are of an age that, well, within perhaps 2 or 3 years, they could all be. Well, the two big ones could be off at doing university, and the little one could be gone in 6 or 7 years, sort of thing. And I got a dog that I wanted. Basically, I went, well, I better get a dog that I want, because when they all go, if I get what they want, because if they had been able to pick, they would have picked some little tiny, you know, little teapot dog, and I didn't know. So I got a border
you're
collie.
big dog kind of guy.
No, it's medium size border collie. Is what it is. That's her fully sized, and you probably saw that she can't really see up over the, you know, up over the edge of this desk here. But yeah, I thought I'll get a dog that I like and who likes me, and she's a good one. Actually, I've had a few, and she's a good one. She's really well behaved and really well trained, and yeah, it's good. So if you're a dog person but you can't have one, obviously where you are now, are you the kind of person that you see a dog at a park and you just have to go up and pet them?
I used to be. That's definitely one of the struggles about lockdown. One of the real struggles, I think. Seeing all of the dogs go past. I live right next to Western Park, near Freeman's Bay, and seeing dogs run by, not being able to touch them, go up, touch them. Such a weird phrase. Go up and say hello. Is definitely tricky. Yeah,
it's an interesting one of the issues. Yeah, they're doing a little stalking thing. We play with the ball up the park, and that's her. There you go. That's my wee girl, and she's a studio dog. She's got a bed downstairs, and she stays here with me. But because there's someone in the house at the moment, she'll run backwards and forwards. Oh, well, that's very good. So you're in a little studio in Auckland. Does that mean no pets at all, or have you lowered your standards to a cat or a fish or something else?
I think we are allowed cats. I don't know. Something about having a pet in an apartment building seems wrong to me. No judgment if you have one. I'm sure they're perfectly happy.
Judge away.
But
I think we're living in a society that is too often worried about words like that. I think judge away. I think keeping an animal in an enclosed space is kind of cruel. I wonder about, and you obviously have Scottish background there, and you've spent time in the UK studying. I've read up on that a bit, and obviously I think about places like London being sort of similar to New York, apartment living and curbside living and that sort of thing. And I don't get it. How can you do that to an animal who originally was someone that would have an area that they protected and looked after that might have been dozens, if not hundreds of kilometers, around. So I think judging is okay.
My flatmate as well he doesn't have a wall on one side of his bedroom. He's just got a giant glass sliding panel.
Right.
And I barely think that's enough privacy for him. So to be honest, if I can't keep him comfortable, I don't think a dog would be the best call.
Now, how is it in Auckland at the moment? You had some connection to Dunedin with the Young Writers Festival down here. I'm assuming that means you now can't come down. What's the latest from Tamaki Makaurau when it comes to, movement, what you're allowed to do, what you want to do?
It's quite confusing still. I think figuring out what you can and cannot do. It's definitely more confusing, I think, given the fact that you can look out your window and see different people making different choices, so to say. But yeah, no traveling down to Dunedin for me, unfortunately, which is a bummer. I've been looking forward to the Writers' Festival for, I think, 6 months to, gosh, maybe even longer than that now, actually. But
because
yeah,
you studied
I love it
here,
down in Dunedin.
you studied in Dunedin.
I did, yeah. I was down in Dunedin for, I think, 5 years all up from 2010. I did my degree in theatre and sociology down there, all the way up to honours, and then I helped organise a theatre company with some friends, some fellow graduates as well. So yeah, lots of great memories in Dunedin.
Yeah, it is weird, the whole looking out the window thing and seeing other people making other choices, eh? I mean, it's not quite the same here, but I'm finding that I'm more comfortable in this period than I was March of last year. I think part of that is because March of last year there was so much unknown, but I'm also less tolerant. Like last year, I think we were all a bit scared, and I was a bit like, "It's okay, it'll be okay. I understand you don't quite get it. It's okay." And this time, I'm like seeing dicks walking into the dairy like this, and I'm like, "Get the fuck out!" I mean, they're supposed to have a mask on. We're trying to do this for everyone, and they're like, "Oh no!" Or they walk in like literally like, and I'm just like, and I thought about it. I've got a local dairy that I use a lot, because I'm one of those people who, for some reason, ends up having to get at least one thing every single day. But I thought the new rules coming in, the mandatory vaccinations and masking at the dairies, they don't have people on the doors for obvious reasons, because they're dairies and there's one person. At the supermarkets, they have someone at the door. And so what I think will happen is the dairies are going to be the places of the unvaccinated, talking about a two-tier society, because there's no one at the door to say, "Show me your passport," once that comes out. And the supermarkets will be the places of the vaccinated, because they'll have the person on the door saying, "Can I? Okay, thank you. Can I say, okay, thank you?" But the dairies won't. And I wonder, and I wonder, yeah, it makes me think about maybe 6 months from now being less comfortable going to the dairy. And maybe, I mean, in my supermarket's only a 3-minute drive away anyway, but yeah, I don't know. It's just, I just thinking about those people making those choices and the conversations that are happening online. I know there's dumpster fires left, right, and center, but I do try and get involved in some of them sometimes when people say things, even if it's just one comment. So I'm following someone at the moment, or friends, never met the person, but friends.
Facebook friends.
Who is saying to everybody in New Zealand, you must not support vaccine passports. And I'm like going, okay, so what are the alternatives? So this is the plan. What are the alternatives? No, this is tyranny. Okay, got it. But what can we do? Yeah, but this is, I'm not here to make, I'm just saying what we shouldn't do. And I'm like, well, even when I go in America, what they're doing is they have passports, or you have to have a clear test. So if you're going into a festival or something, you either need to do a test, and they're doing tests that last 20 minutes. You do a test, you're cleared, you can come in, or you need a passport. And they wouldn't even engage on that conversation. So I'm like, I'll drop a little thing in, but then I'll leave the conversation because it's pointless going on.
Yeah, at the moment, I think I do a lot of musing about it. I would never pretend to be an expert on the way forward as a country. I'd leave that to Ashley Bloomfield. I was thinking about it today, this morning, funnily enough, this idea of mandatory vaccinations or vaccine passports being a kind of impingement on freedom. And I mean, I work in mental health, and partly because of my own lived experience with psychosis, particularly. But I work with a lot of people who, for instance, are under the Mental Health Act, who also do not have a say about medication and
Right.
medication put into their bodies, or where they can live, or choices that they can make. It's a degree of freedom that people under the Mental Health Act lose. And the argument for it is, if they were not under this act, they might be a danger to either themselves or others. That's kind of the main justification they
Wow.
hear. And I can't
take that to the nth degree. You can see how that could be placed in the hands of someone who is choosing not to be vaccinated as well. I don't think it'll ever go there in a legislative way, but someone who's choosing not to be vaccinated is 8 times more likely to pass it on to someone else. And yes, whilst I'm double vaccinated, people who are vaccinated are still getting it, just like people who wear seatbelts still die in car crashes.
Totally.
Or people who use condoms still get STDs or still get someone pregnant. It is that's why there's no such thing as safe sex. There's what we call safer sex. There's no such thing as the perfect situation to be protected from a vaccine, but there's a safer way to be. And I'm safer, but it doesn't mean I'm safe. So therefore, if you're more likely to be carrying the virus, you are more of a danger to me, because people that wear seatbelts still die in car crashes.
I think that distinction between, I feel like sometimes people frame it as my freedom is being taken away, rather than this thing of degrees of freedom, because we all get a license before we drive a car. We all turn 18 before we drink alcohol. Supposedly, but
legally.
Yeah, there are limitations in place on our freedom. That's a part of living in the world, in society. I think it's the degree of freedom is the question. And I feel like sometimes when the idea of having a vaccine, when people feel like it's a choice that's being imposed on them, I think sometimes there's a degree of, you've not felt this discomfort before. You've not felt like, and I've, again, working in the mental health sector, I work with people who experience aspects of their lives imposed on every single day. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not. I've seen gross indecency, and I've seen kind of intervention when necessary, but either way, it's a restriction that I think the community that I work in is very familiar with, and it's interesting looking at it, that conversation suddenly happening in a wider kind of national context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost like, well, you guys are privileged enough that you've never had to think this way about yourself, but there's a sector of society that faces these choices, or kinds of choices, every single day of having. And look, I think that, and this is one of the conversations I've been trying to have with people online who are talking about the government's forcing me to get a vaccine. I still stand by it. No one, well, actually, let me ask you this, right? Because I don't know this within the Mental Health Act capacity, because maybe there are some people within that capacity who are sort of almost literally being forced to have a needle in their arm. I don't know. I'm completely naive to it. But in general society, no one is being held down and have a needle shoved in them. And I liken it to, I've got friends who had young families and they wanted to buy a house, but they couldn't do it in Auckland. So they uprooted their lives. They moved away from family. They moved away from friends. They moved away from support groups, because they thought it was really important for their whānau to own property. Now, some might say I was forced to leave Auckland to buy a house, and was like, no. You just made some really hard choices. And I'm hearing people talking about losing work. It sounds, and they're saying I'm being forced. It's like, no, I don't know if you've seen the Michelle Pfeiffer movie, Dangerous Minds. She has this line where she's in the classroom full of children, teenage kids they're all like off the streets. It's an urban American setting, and there's, gang violence, that kind of stuff. And she has this big long spiel about there are no victims in this classroom. And they even say, so what am I supposed to do when someone's got a gun to my head? And she goes, well, you can go quietly, you can scream, you can make noise. There's always a choice. And whilst that's a bit of an extreme one way, the idea of there's no victims in this classroom, that's been coming back to me a lot for this, because we do have a choice to the very end. And if we make a choice not to get vaccinated, then there are consequences that come with it. And the job thing at the moment, I know people who are going to lose their jobs because they're choosing not to get vaccinated. Now, the difference is there are many jobs in New Zealand where the government mandates criteria around them for you to have them, be that a qualification like a doctor, be that an age like working in a bar, you have to be 18, whatever it is, there are some mandates around them. The difficulty with this one is the mandate has come in after the people have gotten the job. Now, I get that's different, but it's not unique that the government says you must do ABC if you want this job. But I get it. It's a hard choice, but it's still a choice ultimately. But you mentioned the Mental Health Act. So is there anything within that you know of where maybe people are being more forced to take vaccines? Or can someone who's and look, you have to forgive my clunkiness, and if the words I use are incorrect, or if I don't know how the system works anymore, but if there is a situation where people are being held for their own safety against their will, and they don't have the freedoms to go out, but it's under the Mental Health Act, are they still able to deny a vaccine, for example, under this current situation?
I love clunky language. I love that. I love stumbling into new territory. I think it's important. I think most of all, I'm not 100% sure about vaccinations under the Mental Health Act. I wouldn't imagine so.
Okay.
I think you can have mandatory medication, but it's pretty strictly tied to what services think will support your experiences, support your condition, as they would say. Yeah, I can't imagine that. A lot of the conversations that we're having, or that I know I'm having, I think within the community, there are a lot of vaccine hesitant people in the mental health community, simply because Pfizer has created other medications in the past. Pfizer has one of the largest lawsuits, I think, ranging into the $5 billion something dollars. Don't quote me on that. But also, like, most importantly, I'm working with people who have been harmed by anti-psychiatric medication in the past. The idea of putting another substance in their body that's being kind of sold to them from the same pharmaceutical company, from the same kind of medical staff. Like, there's a legitimate reaction of uncertainty and fear to that. Because there is that history of harm. I think it's really, really necessary and important. And actually, I think it's one of the biggest. I think it's a failing of the Ministry of Health, I think in particular, to really engage with that conversation about people who have previous negative experiences with medication and their reluctance to take the vaccine, because it's such a prominent conversation, and I've just seen no widespread information about it, which is pretty disheartening.
It's pretty tough. It's tough though, isn't it? Because, in this day and age, when some ridiculous number, let's say 60%, I'm not sure if that's the exact number, get their news from Facebook, and lots of people don't hear, Magic Talk or News Talk ZB or TVNZ 3 News Hub. They actually don't hear that. So then you kind of go, I agree with you, but what are the channels to then get to that person who's going to then accept it because it's coming from the evil mainstream media, rather than the Facebook post and the group they belong to, which have given all the other information. So I was just having a look when you were talking about Pfizer. I wonder if this is the one you're talking about. Justice Department announced largest healthcare fraud settlement in history. Pfizer to pay $2.3 billion for fraudulent marketing.
Ooh.
So I find it interesting to say that it's marketing as opposed to something that wasn't. I guess if it's marketing, they history of the Department of Justice, a criminal and civil liability arising from illegal promotion of certain pharmaceutical products, the Justice Department announced. Guilty to a felony violation in the FDA Cosmetic Act for misbranding Bextra with the intent to defraud or mislead. Holy mackerel! Oh look, and vaccine hesitancy, I get, because there is no question, no one will challenge that any vaccine will do harm to someone. you know, I've got 3 children, and we had to go through that when we were kids, and you know, we sought the advice of experts, and we had a midwife who said to us, she was very honest, and she said sometimes children react to vaccines. She said, but in her 30 plus years experience, and also was the head midwife at Auckland Hospital and has never lost a child, so she's a pretty good yardstick to go to, meaning never lost a child in childbirth. She said you get 1 free hit. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So if they're going to react, it'll be to the second or third one. So if you give them the first one, the first hit of whatever it is, the MMR or whatever they were doing, measles, mumps, rubella, if they give you a bad reaction on the first one, then you can stop. But so that's what. Now look, let me just say very clearly, I'm not giving medical advice. I don't want to see, not that there ever be a headline, but I don't want to see a tweet saying Pat Britton says. That's what we got told, and that was one of our decisions because we asked the questions. Vaccine hesitancy to me was asking the question, but then finding the answer and then trusting that to start with. I think this whole world we're living in right now is the conversations I'm having with people online are, this is New Zealand today. Like people are talking about tyranny, and I'm like, no, this is New Zealand today. That doesn't mean I don't reserve the right to change my opinion in 6 months from now if I see what you're saying is coming to pass, but I don't see that today. I'm comfortable with what the government is doing today. If they move to a position that I'm uncomfortable with, then I may change my position, which of course gets treated by that small sector of society as, well, it'll be too late then. You need to stand with us now. But I'm like, but I don't see what you're seeing. What I see today is the majority of New Zealand wanting vaccine passports and wanting to be vaccinated so we can get back to some level of normality. Maybe not what it was 3 years ago, but something. That's what I see.
Yeah.
But I see that today.
Heck yeah. Honestly, I think it's funny, like what you were saying about kind of growing up as kids, you know, especially coming from the UK and it just being a kind of expected thing. I remember being in primary school in Scotland and then a van coming around one day with a giant 3-pronged needle to go in your arm, which I don't know what was in it. I have no idea. It was just something that I was like, okay, cool. I'm 7. I'm just going to say yes to this because I have to. I genuinely think that is the point that we will get to eventually with the COVID vaccine. I genuinely do. I think it'll become commonplace. But until that point, I think honestly, the people who are kind of anxious and hesitant and then ask questions, do research, really like work to make sure that they're in the know. Honestly, those people are heroes. I think. I imagine it's not my position, but being in a position of going from against vaccination to pro-vaccination after doing research, that must be such an intense, difficult journey. And I applaud anyone who has the kind of rigor and willpower and strength to go through that, I think.
It's also, I've had a little bit of a dealing with the flat earth community. I actually quite like talking to flat earthers and doing that. And I feel that there is a kindred spirit, for want of a better word, between these two worlds, because the number of people within the flat earth community that then, quote unquote, see the light and then accept a globe is small. And it's a difficult hurdle to get over. And once you get over it, then you lose everything, because in this world of flat earth, and I would say it's quite similar in the world of, I mean, I'm not into labels, but let's just say anti-vax for the sake of expedience, or anti-passport or whatever they want to do. They're trying to sell themselves as pro-choice now, which is always ironic when the people who are saying pro-choice are often the ones who are also anti-abortion. But that's another conversation. But because what they do is they basically become a cult. In fact, I've done a few videos with a few flat earthers, and one of the guys describes becoming a flat earther exactly like someone describes going into a cult, using the same language, you know, things like isolation, things like, he didn't use the word love bombing, but coming into a cult, love bombing is when everyone's your best friend all of a sudden, you know, researching only from those approved sites from other ones, ending up socializing with, living with, it's actually literally all the same check boxes as a cult. And then what happens is isolation from family and friends who are outside that. So, of course, then your world becomes this thing. In that instance, it's flat earth, but let's say this one, it's anti-vax. And then if you turn against your tribe, you literally have no one. And unfortunately, you've probably got the opposing side going, well, of course, we've been telling you that for ages and not being gracious. And you've got your family of anti-vaxxers or flat earthers going, you know, well, now you're the government shill, which is something we're hearing a little bit at the moment. And you're left with no one. So it's actually, it's rare. And I think it's more than brave. It's actually admirable. And yeah, to be able to step out like that away from those conversations is incredibly brave. It's heroic to be able to do that for the few who can.
I think so, yeah. I know Sarah Silverman, I think, has a quote from a few years ago, because I think she was doing some kind of with a conversation or documentary, I'm not sure, but she's got a quote: "People go to where the love is."
Yeah.
Which I think is so kind of, is such a beautiful way of saying, like, regardless of whether it's a positive or negative influence, you know, if it is that source of, if you are getting that sense of community and love from a space, you're going to move towards it. You know, that's everyone's impulse.
Yeah, and look, I think you see that in parenting with children and stuff as well, and certainly school teachers will tell you this, that sometimes kids who aren't getting what they need from their parents will act out just to get something. You know, they're happy, and not that they'd, you know, actively be able to, you know, cognitively place this, but something deep inside them wants something. So bad attention for doing bad things is better than no attention. So you get something. It's and that thing about go where the love is, that's the tribal world we live in, which feels more tribal today than it ever has. And certainly, I know that's a silly thing to say because it was, you know, the human race has been around for so many million years, but I guess within modern times, it feels more tribal today than it sort of ever has amongst our community.
Oh, definitely. I think that thing about attention seeking as well, that's really interesting. You hear it a lot with mental health rhetoric, as a kind of like minimization of someone's experiences. Oh, they're just attention seeking. And I remember struggling with what to kind of respond to that statement for a few years, until I kind of came to the conclusion that if someone is in that much distress, that they're willing to go to this level of behavior for attention,
Yeah.
who cares what the cause is? Who cares? Look at the choice, you know, dig into it, see what need isn't being met, see what they're kind of hungry for that isn't kind of, that they're not feeling, you know. Yeah, we hear that a lot.
I think, and maybe you can bring some clarity for this, because I've done some reading on you and the word psychosis and schizophrenia comes up associated with you. But I think what I read was labeled schizophrenia in the UK, but back in New Zealand, maybe it didn't fit quite so well. So you can talk to that. But what you were also talking reminds me of the time I became aware, I got understanding of someone's mental health issues. We hear a lot in society today that people have anxiety. You know, it seems to be something that more and more people are saying. And I've gone, well, sometimes I'm anxious. You know, I feel a bit anxious sometimes. What does it feel? But when someone described it to me as that feeling before you go on stage, right? Now, I've emceed in front of 30,000 people. That's probably the most anxious I've ever felt. Standing in those wings, about to walk on in front of 30,000 people to MC a concert. But then they explained that feeling you had there, which is adrenaline and all sorts of things to, you know, the fight, flight, or freeze, you know, because you're going into a situation. A little side note, I heard someone once say that the reason speaking in front of crowds, that some say is so nervous, is that when we were in our tribes, the only time you stood up the front and spoke was when you were pleading for your life. And they reckon it's in our DNA. But anyway, then they said, so think about how you felt going on in front of 30,000 people. Now think of that feeling never going away. And I was like, fuck. That just gave me a context to what actual I can't speak to everyone and how everyone experiences anxiety, but how they experience anxiety. And I thought the idea of being able to understand it also makes it a lot more easy, because I'm a flawed human being. I'll just speak for myself, to be empathetic and kind of go, I get it now. If I had that adrenaline going through my body when I was trying to sleep, or whatever it was, it would just make life so much more difficult.
Mm.
And as I said, I'm wondering, you have in a bunch of the stuff I read about you have those two words in particular, psychosis and schizophrenia, floating around you. How important do you think it is that people, because I understand a bit more about your situation through reading, but how important do you think it is for people to understand what people are going through, what these conditions, these disorders, these diagnoses within the mental health sector is, to then help, for example, be more empathetic as to why someone, let's tie it back in, say, might be vaccine hesitant, for example?
I think my take on diagnosis, regardless of what it is, whatever diagnosis we're talking about, and actually, to be honest, language in general, but a diagnosis more than anything should clarify your experiences for you. If a term like schizophrenia or anxiety, or ADHD or depression, whatever, if that word, if you start using it and it doesn't simplify your experience or your understanding of your experience, if it doesn't feel like slotting things into place, feel free to ditch it. Don't use
All
it.
right.
You know, these diagnoses are a shorthand to describe a collection of experiences. You know, the only reason to use them is efficiency. You know, there's a satisfaction, I think, when a diagnosis feels right because it brings a lot of things into perspective. And that's a really kind of satisfying, nice feeling for someone. But if it doesn't do that, don't use it, you know? Speaking from my own kind of experience for schizophrenia, I was mugged in a park in London while I was doing a master's over there, and 2 months later, I had a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia,
Wow.
which is very fast, which is too fast, I would say, but that's what happened. I jumped between maybe 4 or 5 different professionals very, very quickly. I was in a lot of distress at the time, and I ended up going to a mental health center and seeing a caseworker once a week while I was living in London for what would have been like a year and a half after that as well. It wasn't until I moved back to New Zealand and I started working with EPI, which is early psychosis intervention, that I started having conversations with caseworkers and psychiatrists and psychotherapists where it wasn't dropped, but at first it was kind of like, okay, we'll put that word on hold. We'll just take that
Mm,
out of the equation for a second and we'll just talk
mm,
about the experiences. Um, and the difference really about working with EPI versus working through services in the UK was here I would have an hour, sometimes twice a week, to chat through what was happening, how I was coping, how my routine was going, versus in the UK, which was 7 minutes with the doctor once every 2 weeks,
wow.
and 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 then a caseworker as well, who would check up on you for about an hour. And that's not to say that the NHS, the UK system, is terrible or awful or evil. Not at all. They are wonderful. They're good human beings trying their best, and you know, it's a system under stress. And so what happens is you end up with a doctor who has 7 minutes to make a call about your life, which has a dramatic change for the foreseeable future, you know? And once that call is made, it's very hard to change or derail.
Let me just ask you this, because that diagnosis, I'm assuming, would not only, like when you talked about it should be shorthand, I wrote down diagnosis as your signpost. It like points
Mm,
towards how to find the answer because you've got something that helps you get there more quickly. It's shorthand.
mm,
But I would think that there's two things when you get the diagnosis. One, probably a certain drug comes with it.
mm,
But two is obviously you then go, well, how does a schizophrenic live? What does a schizophrenic need to do to function? And so
mm.
if you're given I'm not saying that it was given a misdiagnosis, but if it was, there's not only the drug element, which could be wrong, but also a whole mindset, which could be wrong about it. Is that
Abs-
fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
hitting the nail on the head, to be honest. My first reaction to being diagnosed with schizophrenia was to research any kind of stories or information out there that was available. The only thing that came up with was Russell Crowe's A Beautiful Mind,
Right.
which is not a good resource for
Oh, it's not.
anyone.
Okay.
Actually, no, Beautiful Mind is not that bad, but Beautiful Mind and then hordes of horror films with different variations of serial killers, which was less useful. But essentially, there was no kind of information out there about real people with lived experience living their lives. There was no idea. There was not even about symptoms. I could go onto WebMD or Wikipedia and find like lists of symptoms, and like maybe like 2 or 3 of them would stand out to me.
Right.
But one of the problems with schizophrenia in general is it's such a broad classification. There are so many symptoms out there that can lead you to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, to the point where when you are actually diagnosed as schizophrenic, sometimes it feels like, oh, I'm actually just being put in the too hard basket. They see
Right.
someone who's going through psychosis and who's going through quite extreme distress, and those are the 2 kind of main things. I'm a lot to handle, so I'm going to be given this diagnosis.
Yeah.
Schizophrenia is actually
It's the coverall. It's the coverall title that says you can. That's a very big basket, so we can put you in that one.
Heck yeah, and I mean it's the same. This is as well kind of what I think a little bit of what I might be talking about on the weekend for the Writers' Festival. It's interesting, the mental health kind of discourse on a national level, because on one hand you've got anxiety and depression, which are kind of like the entry point. You see them pop up as a kind of duality every mental health week, and then you've got like the like mental health conditions. You've got bipolar and schizophrenia and BPD, and it's almost this kind of like 2-tiered stratus of diagnosis based off of severity more than anything else, which I think is a really kind of flawed perspective, but I think it's one that we fall into a lot. And yeah, like I said, the problem with schizophrenia is there are so many symptoms that it can classify. And for myself as well, I fit into 1 or 2. I had auditory hallucinations and I experienced delusions for a little while. But other than that, I didn't connect with a lot of what I was reading. I didn't connect with a lot of the kind of information that the doctor was saying. And I moved to New Zealand and went through kind of a really long process of psychotherapy with Epi. And after maybe 2.5 years, we came to the kind of conclusion together that actually this doesn't really fit. Something more along the lines of PTSD or trauma-informed psychosis would actually be a little bit more specific. And even then, like, that wasn't like swapping out one label for another. That was here's another word that you can add to your toolbox. Here's another shorthand that may or may not work, And it was about kind of collecting information and language and terminology and experiences until I could kind of piece things together in a way that made sense. And after I did that, schizophrenia didn't really fit anymore.
When you say auditory hallucinations, I'm thinking that's hearing things, auditory hearing. So you were hearing things that weren't there, and you use the word delusional. And I know that you tell a story of thinking you were in a relationship with someone. And I read about this, so maybe you can expand on it, because I'd like to know how that actually worked. It's crazy to say in your mind, because maybe it was a bit broken at the time, but where you thought that you were in a relationship with someone, you were at a party talking about my boyfriend, and people were going, "Oh, show us your pictures, we want to see." And then the story I read says you were in your phone, and at that point you realized you weren't in a relationship with this person. So how do you go from looking in your phone to that leading to the realization that that's a delusion?
It's funny. I'm running a play about this relationship that's hopefully was actually supposed to open or close today, funnily enough. It's postponed to next March. But I know that poem, I think, that you're referencing. That experience, that kind of searching on your phone for a photo, happened repeatedly over and over again for a few months, I would say. So it wasn't necessarily one single experience of realizing. It was more people would ask questions, you would kind of jump into those questions thinking, oh yeah, I can show you a picture, I have that. And then as it kind of like ticks through your brain and more questions get asked, it's kind of like do you know that point in an argument when you're like going hard at someone, really going at it, and it gets to the point where you're actually just arguing because you want to win? And there's a point in the argument where you realize, fuck, I'm wrong, but I cannot back down now.
That is no, I don't know that at all. What are you talking about?
But it's exactly like that. It's exactly like just like going through the motions and then suddenly, fuck, I'm wrong, and I have to kind of try and maneuver my way out of this. And it's tricky because that situation happened a few times over a series of months, and friends, of course, knew that it was happening before I did, so they would kind of gently lead into this thing of, oh, cool, who's Chris? Can you tell us about Chris? And of course, they've done this before, so they're just kind of going through the motions. And it's that kind of like slow realization again and again and again. And eventually over time that happens, like the instances of it happening are further apart, they're less intense, and eventually it's just like, oh, okay, no, this is, yeah. And now Chris,
I think it's quite surprising, and I'm sure as you're saying it, you're aware of what we've just been talking about. But we were talking about before, I use flat earthers as an example and anti-vaxxers because of what's going on right now and the ability for them not to back down. And now you're talking about this moment within Psychosis where is like an argument where you can't back down. And I'm just sitting here going, I wrote down, I can't back down. I'm like, gosh, it's the worst thing in the world to do would be to try and diagnose 100,000 people over a podcast. But are these people who are the leaders of the anti-vax world are they going through some kind of psychosis? I don't think that's true, but it's just really interesting to see how the words you're using in that moment and likening it to an argument where you can't back down is happening all over the world right now with people who just can't back down, but they don't have a label for it of psychosis.
Yeah, and honestly, I tell you, I love conspiracy theorists. I love it. I love that behavior because I don't think it's psychosis. I also don't think that. But whenever I see that kind of story, that kind of media come up, it's a reminder for me that, oh yeah, this behavior that on the extreme end we call delusion is actually a natural, like, human phenomenon. Like, there are degrees of this, like superstition on a very, very minor end. Like, oh, if I step on a crack, I will have on the pavement, I will have bad luck for the day or whatever, And lots of people go through that thinking, I know it's not true. Still not going to step on the crack though,
Yeah.
And you kind of like push that along the scale, and then towards like the 3/4 mark, you've got conspiracy theorists, and then you start going into like realms of psychosis and delusion. But it's this kind of scale of behavior that actually everyone has to a degree,
And I think as you say that, I'm talking about that reference to anxiety before. Someone can be anxious and someone can have anxiety, and that might be on the same level, but maybe the person who's anxious is just experiencing a very mild form of a mental health diagnosis for a very small time. Like I'm thinking about as well, what do you call the names just jumped out of the words just jumped out of my head. But men who think they're always right, they're always the center of the world.
Narcissist?
Yeah, so you can be a narcissist, or you could have like have narcissistic personality disorder, or you can act in a narcissistic way. But so these degrees, and I'm not using that as an excuse for people to act as narcissists, but that's what I hear when you're saying that. Maybe the anxiety one's a better example. Like I feel anxious sometimes, but I'm not diagnosed with anxiety.
And I think that's definitely true. I think narcissism is a great example. I think, um, I mean, disability is not a kind of one size fit all label by any means, and I don't even think it's a word that we really talk about in terms of what it means. But I think there is something to be said of this thing of, if your experiences are getting in the way of um, you living your life the way that you want to, if your experiences, whether it's anxiety or depression or psychosis, whatever, if they are impinging on your ability to do what you want and live your life safely, that's the point where it steps into this realm of, okay, maybe we can talk about like additional support or
Mm.
medication or therapy, then we can kind of start to think about it in terms of a medical kind of setting. And so I do think that line kind of exists, that line of like, is this impinging on your life? But it's important to remember that there is blur between those two spaces, like we make that line so that doctors can make diagnoses, so that we can talk about it within a kind of framework, within a kind of diagnostic framework or a pathological framework. But everyone has these experiences. Absolutely everyone.
As you're describing your experience, and I think you said that his name was Chris. And then I think, and I'm this is off the top of my head, so correct me for the title, but the play, was it Chrome Dome and the Schizo or something, was written about
Yes.
that. And I'm assuming Chris must be bald, because that would be the Chrome Dome thing. I could be wrong. That's how I listen.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it anyway.
Yeah.
Being
I've had so many conversations with different therapists, different professionals about so Chris was a cancer patient. Chris was a cancer patient who I met in a mental health unit under the pretense that he was self-harming, and it became a very kind of or the idea of it became a very codependent relationship. Uh, Lots of discussions have been had about victim narrative and savior complex and my own kind of behavior and habits and approach to things, which I don't say mockingly. Very important conversations have been had about that. But yeah, no, Chris was bald and not particularly well. So yeah,
And
there's
so
a degree of
just for clarity, because I just think when you said met, he was a real person. He wasn't someone that you thought was there. He was. I've always thought it was an actual human being, but you met
no,
him. Oh, he wasn't there.
no.
Oh, okay, that makes a huge difference.
Totally
Because
created.
okay, so this is okay. This is good, because I'm now that's wow. Okay, because so in other words, going through the phone, there's no photos of Chris, because Chris doesn't exist.
Yeah.
My thoughts when I read about it, and maybe this is why I said, when you said met, I was like, oh, hang on, I've got this wrong, because I was thinking maybe he's a person that was in the hospital, but you sat at the table with him, had breakfast, but there was no relationship. But this wasn't even a person. There was no one there. So did you believe that there was a person there and that you had a relationship and a conversation with them, or did you know that there wasn't, and it was a part of the story you were telling yourself?
A little bit of both, to be
Okay.
honest. Again, and it kind of like weaves in and out of both. Like there were periods of time where I was aware of Chris but very aware that he was not real, kind of like that stepping on a crack thing. It's like I
Right.
know that it's not real, but I'm still gonna like play through it a little bit. And then there were times where I was fully under the impression that I was in a relationship.
Because what
Um,
I was visualizing, and I think you might have talked about this before, was the relationship with the Joker. The new Joker, the newer Joker movie, where then
mm,
he thinks he's in a relationship with a neighbor. The neighbor's a real
mm,
person, but he's not in relationship with her. He's imagining the relationship, although she's real. That's what I was kind of thinking about you and Chris. But okay, now I'm clearer. Wow.
mm,
So in your
yeah.
head, is there a very clear picture of what Chris looks like and who Chris is?
Yep. 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 I He's this kind of, it's odd, very odd that he is bald, and yet when I remember him, I also remember him as being blonde. Talk about psychosis. Don't know how those two things exist together, but I would be able to tell people that he was both bald and blonde. um, yeah, but no, over time it became this very kind of like and I wasn't even aware of it happening while it was happening, to be honest. It kind of slowly transitioned from being a belief to being a memory.
Okay.
And now it kind of exists in this kind of further extension of that, where it's like, oh, okay, I know it's not really a memory, it was a kind of construction. I still think of Chris very much as real.
Wow.
But yeah.
Are you able to step outside yourself now and go, how do I feel about, it's almost like, how do I feel about how I feel about how I was in that moment? Like back then, like looking back on it and knowing these things weren't real. But as you say, still kind of, to me, when I hear you describing what it was, it kind of feels like you're describing it was almost like a dream scenario, like it was a ethereal kind of, was it real, was it not real? But you've said you still kind of think of him as real, even though you know he wasn't. So how do you feel today, thinking about how you felt back then? Are you able to separate that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, it's that thing of the conversation going from having an emotional investment to kind of philosophizing about it, almost that idea of him being real, you know. And I think our definition of what's real and what's not changes based off of how much of an emotional investment we have in that thing, you know. So now when I think of Chris as real, I tend to get quite political about it. Usually it's in the sense of kind of explaining it as a kind of reflexive kind of thing. And so real in the sense of, oh yeah, he was a construction from my brain that my brain at some point in my life believed that I needed. My brain created this for me to keep me safe or to try and meet a need that it thought I
Right.
had, which is how I kind of contextualize it. Again, not a medical professional.
No.
But
But when you say, but also when you say politicize it, is it a way? I mean, you do speak a lot. I mean, we haven't even talked about your writing yet. We've been talking for 52 minutes. We've been talking about more about my fucking puppy than about your writing. So, which we will reverse shortly. But I was saying, when you say you talk about it politically, is that because you do speak about mental health a lot? If you look up your name online, there is a lot about your mental health, and you're speaking publicly about it. So when you say politically, do you sort of also mean this is a part of my mental health story, and I'm now using it to speak about mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's for me as well, because of the work that I do, because I have the privilege of being in a kind of public facing position, being a performer, being a writer. There is an aspect to my experience going through kind of healthcare, which I started making work about psychosis and schizophrenia when I first got the diagnosis, and it was a way of kind of running with it, making the most of it. And there were a lot of spaces, magazines, different kind of organizations who really capitalized on it, which is unfair, and not an accusation, but it is true. You know, I was a person diagnosed with schizophrenia who was educated, spoke well, creative. So there were
Yeah.
a lot of opportunities and a lot of privileged opportunities for me to be able to speak about that experience. And I became very aware, very consciously of the fact that it was aspects of myself that were allowing me to enter these spaces, and that that became tied up with my my own kind of personal mental health journey for a while. One of the real like tricky parts of me from losing or stepping away rather from the schizophrenia diagnosis was I felt like I was a fraud and a liar for a long time with the work that I had been doing.
Right.
I had to also really look at myself and how kind of complicit I was in the spaces that I took up. I had to reinterrogate those. And so when I say political, I think what I mean is whenever I talk about my experiences now, because they have changed so much and the labels and the language have changed so much over a period of time, 5 or 6 years now, I have to be really aware of the flexibility of that language. I have to be really aware and vocal. I think that's a responsibility of just how much things can change and how much time and space and awareness we have to give in those kind of media situations to how much experiences can change. It took me a long time to become okay with myself and realize, actually, I wasn't the sole person in charge of my diagnosis. I was a part of an entire mental health system and an entire system of like media as well, again, public facing opportunities of people who were kind of narrating and pushing my experience, my story in certain ways.
Yeah.
It took me a really long time to become okay with the fact that actually it's okay if this changes. It's okay if I learn and know myself better. That's actually a really important part of this journey. And it's important to be vocal about that change.
Well, it just makes me extra grateful that you've decided to come talk to us as well, because this is we just talk long. Can I ask you about the Joker movie? Is that an okay thing to ask you about? Because it was very divisive. It was very, very divisive, and I was watching something on YouTube the other night, talking about there was a lot of controversy about it when it came out, and that was possibly one of the things that helped it in its opening weekend do $250 million when it would only cost them $50 million to make, sort of thing. Apparently had the same opening weekend as one of the Avenger movies, and the Avenger movies cost $300 million to make or something like that. I wanted to read something, and I'm not going to identify who it is because I haven't asked them and I haven't had permission from them to say it, but I will say something that was put up on a Facebook page that I saw when it came to Netflix. So it came to Netflix fairly recently, and then a whole new group of people saw it. This person wrote, just watch Joker. How and why does this ableist shit still get made and lauded, yet we wonder why there is still so much shame around discussing psychiatric conditions? I'm just going to take it off that page because when I share my screen, I can put it back on your page so it doesn't get it. I read that and I thought it's an interesting. I never saw it that way. I'm not part of the community. I'm not part of the community that would see it that way. So I did my research, right? Because that's what I typically do. And I came across, and it's just one person's opinion, but I came across this really interesting post. This is an article written in the Sydney Morning Herald by a psychiatrist. And I'm not going to read it all out, but part of what the psychiatrist says is, being a psychiatrist, I abhor negative depictions of the mentally ill, but as an ardent Batman fan, I was hopeful. As it happens, I was blown away. Joaquin Phoenix's towering performance and Todd Phillips's masterful direction undoubtedly helped, but mostly it was the way it approached mental illness. Now, I'm not trying to say, phew, so that means it's an okay movie and there's no problems, but it did cause a lot of controversy. Your story, as I said before, though I got it wrong, sort of reminded me a bit of what we were seeing on screen. If it's okay to ask, what do you think of the Joker movie when it was so divisive amongst some in the community?
I detest it. I really detest it. Talk about judgment. I don't think a film made me that angry for so long. I think there's actually. Have you seen my Facebook post about it?
No, I haven't. Possibly I should have.
I have a massive thing about it. I can't actually remember what's in it, but the thing about Joker, I remember sitting in a theater, and there's a moment where he opens the door, and I think it's the subject of his kind of delusion is in front of him.
The neighbor.
And he the neighbor, and he goes in for like a kiss, or there's some kind of romantic, and she's like, wait, what are you? And then there's this like quick smash cut of, holy fuck, she wasn't real, he's psychotic. And yeah, like you said, that experience matched very closely to my own, and it really, really affected me. I remember being kind of trapped in my cinema seat, not really being able to move.
Wow.
I remember thinking that this movie had kind of targeted me somehow, which it hadn't, but hey, psychotic. The thing that bugged me about Joker is it gets so much right in terms of the actual physical presentation of symptoms. I think I mean, it's a great performance in terms of like craft. It's well made, it's well acted, directed, all in terms of craft on its own, it's very well done. But it's kind of like that thing in the queer community where it's like, you know what? These sad gay films where the character dies at the end and it's really heartbreaking for the gay lover that's left behind. Those films are all great, but we've had 100 of them and we've had 0 love stories. Could we have a love story? I think it's kind of the same thing for me with Joker. Joker, well-made film, but it's partly a mentally ill character being used as a catalyst to talk about American economy. It's a mentally ill character being used to talk about the violence and stress and harm that the class system in America can cause, and that kind of inevitable revolution at the end, because that is the climax, people rioting in the street. And it's a mentally ill character being used as just kind of a prop, to be honest. Like I remember coming back. See, you got me started on Joker now. This is such a I remember coming back to New Zealand, and I was really eager to make art about my experiences. I was really eager to make art about schizophrenia. And one of the things that Changing Minds, which is a phenomenal organization, told me was, if you want to make these kind of stories, we'll support you, but you should really try and focus on ending them hopefully. They should end with hope. And I remember having a really negative reaction to that in the beginning, because it felt like what they were saying was, it needs to end positively. It needs to end happy, which was not my experience. And I didn't want that to be my experience. I didn't want to be dishonest, Over the years, the more I've worked with that organization, the more, and the Mental Health Foundation as well, Like Minds Like Mine is another really good one. The more I've realized that actually what ending your work with hope really means is ending your work with options for the audience to continue moving in. And what I mean by that is, if you're making a work that features psychotic experience, a character going through lived experience of psychosis, you have a responsibility, even if the ending isn't positive, to give people with those similar experiences in the audience, who are relating to your work, who are saying, oh yeah, that's me. I'm seeing aspects of myself on screen or on stage or in a book. Cool, whatever. You need to give them avenues to continue thinking and continue moving forward. I see so much media out there that does not give any way forward for people with lived experience. And that's, I think, one of my main problems with the Joker. He is always a catalyst. He is always a symbolic kind of device to spark a story, to spark a discussion. Joker was a talk about class and welfare and the way that we treat, but and I mean, the ending is him like doing a dance and breaking out of Arkham, I think. Is that right? Him kind of like
so.
down, and again, it's the sort of thing of like, he's going to do it again. And it's like, if you're going to get the experiences right, then he cannot just be a catalyst. He cannot just be an inciting incident in your stories. You have to tackle the actual humanity that you're using, because you're using psychotic experience, And I feel like in my work, that rings so true, honestly, for a lot of my earlier kind of shows. I did a work called Breathe when I first came back to New Zealand, which was about my experience of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was about looking back over a period of years and putting events into this new kind of context of being a person who lives with psychosis. And after that show, it went really well. It got a really good reaction for the most part. And and I remember at the end of each night and at the end of the run, feeling so incredibly hollow and so incredibly alone. And it shook me for a long time, because I didn't know caused that. I had done this work that people were celebrating. People were saying that they liked the writing. They thought I was brave. You know, they were like, oh, this is a really important story, that we need to see more of this. And then they would leave and I would be alone. And I realized that what I was doing was presenting this real kind of like positive idea of myself, and like, look at me, I like, this is me, like showing you what psychosis is like and then how I'm getting through it. And it's a really optimistic, positive story. And then people were coming and watching and going, yeah, cool, and then leaving. And I didn't give myself any avenue. I didn't give myself an ending for, and this is how I'm going to keep going.
Right.
You know, the point of my early work a lot of the time was, I'm thriving, I'm doing really well. Schizophrenia is not scary. Book me on your breakfast show. You know, which sells. People love that. People really love to see like someone thriving. But if there isn't that kind of avenue for how a person is like continuing to thrive and how they're going to continue forward, then you're doing a disservice, and you're only kind of doing half of the job.
I also think I'll come back to that in a second, but
So it's a huge rant.
No. It's amazing, because I want to come back to that thriving thing in a sec. But I was going to say, you've put into context the Joker movie for me, because there's not many movies that I've left and I've gone, that from my perspective, and apologies to those who disagree with me, but fuck, what a brilliant movie. I hated it. You know what I mean? It's like, there's not many movies that I come out of, if any actually, that I go, I don't ever want to see that again. Although I have watched it again on Netflix when I saw it came there, but I don't ever want to see that again. But that was a great piece of cinema. And I guess that's me going, kind of acknowledging what you've said about how it was made and that, but not belonging to the subject matter. So identifying that the subject matter is awful, meaning it felt awful. I felt for the character, you know, it's just, I came out of there feeling just, oh, what is going on? This is, you know, but also acknowledging it was an amazing piece of cinema. And actually, I don't mean you're owning it much more than me, obviously. I don't hear you using those words, but for someone who's not have an understanding or experience of that, sounds like we're saying quite similar things. But I don't therefore go in and say this is an ableist piece of shit, because I'm not part of that community. I kind of go, it's an amazing movie. I don't know if you should see it though, because you'll come out of it feeling awful. Make sure you don't see it on a weepy day when you're feeling a bit blue, you know?
Yeah, heck yeah. I feel like, and that's actually, like, speaking of the festival as well, like that will be something that I think I'll be talking about a lot. Like, sometimes our ideas of craft and our ideas of what good craft is, so what makes a good film and what makes a good theater, which is the realm that I kind of work in predominantly, or what makes a good poem or a good book, whatever. We have ideas about that, and part of our enjoyment and part of our satisfaction when experiencing something is whether or not it lives up to our expectations. And that means, I think, that no matter what it's talking about, you've got to question as an audience member what your expectations are going into something, you know? Sometimes with mental health media, the problem is people's expectations around psychosis, for instance, is like, oh, I'm going to see violence. I'm going to see someone who's going to be really violent. They're going to be like totally, they're not going to be coherent, you know? And that's just not true. That expectation is built on years, centuries of misinformation and fear mongering and substandard service of care to people who experience those, you know? And I feel like over time, some of those expectations have become so molded into craft, into the way we make things, that actually, even as professionals, as theater makers and filmmakers, we don't even question them anymore. We just take them for granted. And what ends up happening is exactly that, you know? You end up making Joker, which is a great film for all intents and purposes. Lots of aspects of that film come together really nicely and are really well made. But ethically, in terms of whether it subverts expectations that need to be kind of turned on their head, if in the case of like, does it serve the community that it's talking about. I don't always think that, you know. So good film, yes.
But maybe
Echo.
that's the problem. It's not a film set up to service the community it's talking about. It's a film set up in this economy we live in to make bank and win awards. You know what I mean? So it's not an infomercial to help someone solve a problem. It's a film, and I'm not saying that this is right, but I'm just trying to be a realist. It's a film to get an audience to return a dividend. That's what it's about.
Oh, totally, 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
we make jokes about that. There are jokes about that on like sitcoms, you know, like, oh yeah, this is Meryl Streep's Oscar grab, you know, this is a middle-aged white woman crying in Victorian era, you know, like we make those jokes because we're kind of aware of what it is, right? We're aware of the films that we expect to go into those award spaces. And as well, like in terms of like speaking to the mental health community specifically, I remember in the early 2000s, this is an example I like using a lot. There was a kind of explosion of films that starred single mothers looking after neurodiverse children, predominantly boys with autism, who also like often had savant syndrome, and this was a period of like 4 or 5 years, maybe. I remember Zac Efron was in one. And it's such an interesting trope. It's such an interesting like device and subgenre to look into, because the neurodivergence in those stories is used primarily as a device to demonstrate the mother's suffering and how hard she's working for her children. And it's used as I wrote a master's degree about it. And I used to call it a sympathy trap. These characters are there to make you feel sorry for the mother, not because you know her experience or you've gone through it, but because, and I mean this because this is a real thing that happens in life, right? Like single mothers are out there working like night and day to the teeth for their children, right? And we know of that kind of like concept, we know of that archetype, but it doesn't mean we've got any personal experience of it. We've just got a kind of like conceptual awareness of it. And there was a period of films that really capitalized on it to really make us feel for these single struggling mothers. And there are so many different like subgenres of like different experiences that are the same, you know, like Joker, you know, the kind of character with psychosis who is beaten down on repeatedly and snaps. You know, like there's so many of these little tropes in subgenres that exist that utilize the mental health community and the disabled community in different ways.
I was thinking about a positive movie, and it's not really. I don't think it's a mental health movie because, or health, you know, showing a mental health issue. But Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, because I think that's something. If you've seen the movie, that's something he does to himself to forget something. But it seems to have elements of you know, issues around mental health that he tries to come through, which has got kind of that outcome. But look, I just wanted to say one quick thing, because I know we actually have to let you go. I mean, it feels like we're only halfway through our conversation, but we need to let you go. You were talking about writing a lot of your stuff in the start to write about you thriving. And I just thought to myself, and I'm being completely respectful to your art when you're writing about thriving, but if you think about the greatest pieces of art there have ever been, be it a movie, be it a piece of art, be it a play, I don't know if they often come from a place of thriving. I mean, as we were talking about Joker and talking about the thing, I was thinking also about Life is Beautiful, you know, the Oscar-winning movie from about 15 years ago with that horrific ending. And it feels to me that if you look at even any form of art, you know, the greatest comedians, they often come from a place of being broken or from a place of difficulty to start with, but not from a place of thriving. And I wonder how much within the artistic community, you know, across all mediums, actually thriving is counterproductive to good art.
I'm always whenever I do workshops, I usually try and drop in the joke that if you introduce a therapist into Othello, it's over in 15 minutes. You know, He talks to someone. He talks to Desdemona about the handkerchief. Boom, problem solved. talk about your problems. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, theater is a really interesting one, I think, because it's so predicated around the idea of conflict. You know, characters in conflict hoping to achieve something, and then that journey of either achieving or failing to achieve it, and then changing as a result, is kind of the backbone of a lot of stories out there. You know, I have a very much love-hate relationship with theater overall. It's where I started. It's where I grew up. It's changed my life in lots of ways. Shows that I see now still change my life in phenomenal ways. I think there is a lot more engagement with the disabled community that the craft has to do, like the theater community on a craft level has to engage with, because I think sometimes that kind of like set up, intensify, subvert ending, you know, I sometimes think that structure leads to this kind of journey of like suffering, triumph, and we're good, and we have the girl, you know, and that's fine in certain contexts, but I think sometimes we have to be more, for some stories and some experiences, I think we really do have to be more specific, and we have to really look at the position that we leave our characters in, because sometimes, and I know I was speaking from personal experience, you know, I mean, Breathe was that, my first show was very much suffering, this is hard, and now I know what it is, boom, heck yeah. You know, and that worked, and it was successful in certain spaces, and people like saw that journey, and it was fine. And again, you know, it left me really lonely. It didn't leave me with a way to continue, you know. And sometimes theater is very bad at that, you know. Theater isn't very good at showing experiences that don't necessarily wrap up neatly, you know. Sometimes mental health experiences continue our whole lives, you know. When something doesn't finish and you live with it for the rest of your life, sometimes theater isn't the best at telling those stories, you know, as it like currently exists. But I think it can. And I think if we interrogate the craft and come up with new exciting ways of storytelling, that we can learn how to modify certain things and tell those stories.
Well, look, I think we've ended on a positive for this podcast, at least. If people want to find out more about you, and we didn't talk specifically about your writing, but maybe we'll do part 2 in a few months' time. Dan.Goodwin93 on Instagram is a good place to find you. Look, thanks so much, Dan, for joining us. I know we've got to get out now because you've got to head off to something else, but it's been a huge privilege and a great joy to speak to you. And I hope that we can do it again someday real soon.